It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about church history, particularly the years between 301 and 490 AD, is Mike Aquilina. Thanks for being here, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Kyle.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. This book is not the first in this series. You edited the first book in the Reclaiming Catholic History series. Why did you want to write this one yourself?
Well, I've always been interested in the fathers of the church, and of course these are the later fathers. Actually, usually I go for the earlier fathers, but I knew that I wanted Jim Papandrea to edit one of the volumes in my series, and Jim's specialty is the early fathers. So I went and I booked him for the first volume, and I wrote the second volume. So the second volume in the series was the first to come out, but now I'm eagerly waiting Jim's, which will be out next month.
And this one, again, it's called The Church and the Roman Empire, basically 4th and 5th century. What is most important about this time period?
Well, it's a time when the prayers of the early church were finally answered in a way that they could see. They had been praying for 270 years, thereabouts, for an end to persecution, an end to these martyrdoms that were occurring, an end to the hardship that their families were suffering. And finally, their prayers were answered in the way they wanted. The peace of the church. Constantine took the throne, legalized Christianity, invented this idea that we now call religious freedom, and imposed it on his empire. And now they had peace in the church. They were able to have freedom of movement and thought and public activity. So it was a decisive change in the church's life, and it marks off a certain period, when Christianity was no longer persecuted officially, but now it was the dominant cultural force in most of the world.
So was that all a positive, or was there some negatives roped in there as well?
Now, there were definitely some negatives, because whenever you have a dominant cultural force, you're going to have a lot of people who want a piece of it, either for economic gain or political gain or just for control. I mean, the emperors then were worried about any divisions in Christianity, because that would mean a division among their people, and it would mean unrest, and the government never likes unrest. So there were many attempts to hijack the church for this end or another end, and those are important events in history. We learned from those, and we should learn those lessons again and again. So I tell those stories in the book.
Yeah, how different is the church today versus this 4th and 5th century church?
Well, in many ways, it's very different. But in the basic ways, it's not different at all, because human nature has not changed. The sins we commit are the same sins we committed back then. Our weaknesses are the same weaknesses they had back then. And our temptations are pretty much the same they had back then. The scenery changes, but the play remains the same. So it's important for us to look back at those times and not make the same mistakes that were made back then. It's good for us to see how the great saints responded in times of challenge, and to see how we can calibrate our individual lives to follow the same pattern.
And what ways have we learned from our mistakes, and you can see how we've evolved? In what ways are maybe we repeating some of the same mistakes today?
Well, there's nothing new under the sun, and so many of the things that make us, slap our palm on our forehead today are things that we dealt with so long ago, and it seems like we never learn our lessons. So we can look back then, and we could see the difficulties of religion, for example, getting tangled up in government and public policy. And yet, we do want to have an effect on government and public policy because all of this involves morality. We want to influence it, but too often we trade influence for favors, for entanglement, for silence. And this happened in the time of the Roman Empire, when we wanted to please the emperors who were taking good care of us. And it happens still today. We're willing to be quiet on certain issues if the government continues to give us certain other things that we want in return. It's an old story, but it's important for us to be aware of it so that we don't compromise as some of our ancestors did.
Right. We're talking with Mike Aquilina, the author of The Church and the Roman Empire, 301 to 490, Constantine, Councils, and the Fall of Rome. You have a chapter in here on Nicaea. What was so important about Nicaea?
Well, it was the first ecumenical council, so it established a certain precedent. We've had quite a few of them since then, and often they're game changers. They're historic events. Mm-hmm. In that case, it really did mark the turning point in history that I talked about earlier. The time, that transition from the time of persecution to the time of cultural dominance. Why? Because the council was called by the Emperor Constantine. But when he showed up for the council, he was able to greet bishops who had suffered as confessors during the time of persecution, and it said that Constantine greeted them by kissing their wounds. Some of them had had their eyes plucked out. He kissed their eye sockets. They had their hands amputated. He kissed where their hands had been, and it's a vivid image of a pivotal point in history. Nicaea was very important because now that the church was out in the open and enjoying a certain degree of peace, well, all of its dirty laundry was now public. And so this argument about core Christian doctrine was now a very public argument. And also, as I said earlier, it was much of a concern for the emperor. It threatened to divide the people of the church, the people of his empire, and it threatened to bring an end to the strength and the peace that he had achieved by legalizing Christianity. So for many reasons, Nicaea was important. And still today, when we go to church on Sunday, we recite the creed that began there, whose first version was coined there at the Council of Nicaea. We recite the Nicene Creed.
And the chapters of the book are divided into stories of important people and answering some myths about the church. How did you choose which people to highlight?
Oh, boy. Well, in this entire series, what I've emphasized and what our other authors have emphasized is the strength of the story. So we try to write history that's interesting. We wanted this to be different from the history you had in high school, where you just were assigned names and dates to memorize for the quiz. Mm-hmm. We wanted this to go on the strength of story. Memorable story, so that people would walk away having a sense that they were there, that they were witnesses to these long ago events. So really, I went for the most interesting characters and the best stories. They're all important, but I wanted to play to memory, to get people to remember the stories of the early church.
So do you have a favorite person or a favorite story from this time period?
It depends on the day of the week. I'm very fond of Augustine, of course, because he was the greatest mind of that time, and he really did synthesize all that came before him, and he laid the foundations for all that came after him. He was one of the maybe 5 most influential figures in human thought. He'd be up there. But I'm also fond of St. Jerome because he was just cranky and curmudgeonly and funny. He was the Don Rickles of his time. Really? And you wonder, how did this guy get to be a saint? But, he gives hope for all the rest of us. So I include the stories of Augustine, St. Jerome, and many other figures all across the spectrum of Christian achievement and behavior.
You also have this You Be the Judge section, and that addresses misconceptions about the church. Do you have a myth during this time period that annoys you the most?
All of the myths that involve Constantine.
Okay.
Because you'll often hear that Constantine wrote the Bible or invented the liturgy or any number of things, and people try to present the things they don't like about Christianity as innovations that were introduced by Constantine. The truth is that Constantine made very little difference in the deposit of faith. What Constantine did was legalize everything, but the liturgy was in place. The books of the New Testament were in place. The practices of the church were already well in place by the time Constantine was born. These things had been well established for centuries. So Constantine really did not make that kind of difference in the life of the church, even though you'll read books like the Da Vinci Code that make claims like this. They're absurd claims, but they've entered the bloodstream, so to speak, and we want to try to help cure that disease with this book.
And all this talk about church history, I think a lot of us might be focused more on apologetics or how can I grow in my faith and maybe see church history as not really having an impact. Maybe it's an interesting story. And I know you say like history repeats itself and things, but honestly, most of us aren't involved with these big church decisions. And so how does studying history have an impact on us?
Well, it does affect us individually because we can see our place in the story. We can see that history does not always turn on the actions of the people whose faces appear on coins or in important news stories. History often turns on a statement of a beggar, a chance event that happens in the street. Suddenly people are swept up into it. And we can see then that our lives are pivotal. Our lives are important, that God has a plan, and it involves each and every one of us, not just the people who are celebrities, not just the people who are in the top government slots. No, it involves everyone. We all have our part to play in history, and that's an important lesson for us to learn.
So the first book, The Early Church, covered about 300 years. The second book covers about 200 years. I'm assuming that you have this all plotted out and outlined on how these books on Reclaiming Catholic History are going to go. Can you give us a little outline of how you divided up church history?
Well, yeah, it's a pretty standard division. It's kind of what you see in most other history series. We have the volume on the early church, and then my volume on the Church and the Roman Empire. We have the Church and the Dark Ages, the Church and the Middle Ages, the Church and the Reformation, the Church and the Age of Enlightenment, the Church facing the modern age is the last one. So, we do accept the common terminology of the ages, even though that is hotly disputed among historians, and we try to respond to it, and we try to be critical of it. One thing that we wanted to do with this series is not to cover anything up, not to use euphemisms, but to confront things squarely and give solid answers that people can use in apologetics, but also to help, that would help them understand their own history, because all of these events went into making the church what we have received today and what has formed these people in faith and in life.
So how recent will you get and still consider it church history?
I think we're going to stop at 2000.
Okay. All right. We'll be looking forward to that. And for now, where can people get, is it just the first two volumes that are out right now?
Right now, it's just the second volume that's out, and the first volume will be out there soon afterward.
The prequel.
And you can, yes. So, I always recommend you get the books from your local Catholic bookseller if you have one. If not, go to the website of Ave Maria Press. If you have any trouble finding it, you'll find it at all the usual online sites.
All right, and people can check out your website as well, fathersofthechurch.com. But again, the book we've been talking about today is The Church and the Roman Empire, 301 to 490, Constantine, Councils, and the Fall of Rome. Thank you so much, Michael Aquilina, for putting this together, share a little bit about Catholic history with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Kyle.